Hey, I'm Morgan Page. I'm a DJ, remixer, and producer, and today we're going to go over all the plugins that are included in my Waves EMP Toolbox. Okay, so here's the song that I'm working on right in the middle of the album process. And I'm gonna go in and show you how I'm using each of these plugins in my bundle. And I'm gonna show you kind of just the chain of plugins that I'm using, the order that I'm using the plugins, the versatility that you can get with each of these plugins, and the combinations of them. So we're gonna start with the vocals here. And in front here, you see a pretty big stack of vocals. I've had some sessions where there could be 50 or 60 vocals, but this is pretty basic for these purposes. Leads, doubles, whisper takes, harmonies. Let's start with the leads. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. So you can hear there's a lot of high end on that, a lot of air. It's a pretty simple plugin chain, basically using the Waves HEQ to take out the rumble, add a little high-end sheen, a little bit of a high shelf on there. We'll talk more about this one later on. But the key plugin in this chain is the Maserati VX1. So I'm using contour number 1, and it's important to set the sensitivity so it's about yellow or orange. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. So it's a moderate amount of compression. I'm boosting the treble a bit. I have the effects all the way down because I'm actually grouping all the Maserati effects, the vocal effects, on one bus. So I can shape and EQ all the effects as one, and also so I can mute them all quickly because I have the Maserati VX1 on every one of these vocals. When I'm starting a mix, I like to have the effects on it just to feel kind of confident in the vocal. Especially when it's an early take or it's rough, it's not a final vocal. When you hear it dry, you can be a little too critical with your work sometimes. And I like to hear it with tuning on there, with auto-tune, but also a little bit of enhancement, a little bit of effects. And then later on, I'll bring the effects down and maybe carve the EQ a bit so it can sit in the mix. But early on, I just like to have a fairly wet vocal. And so I'm inspired and I'm happy with the performance. So we can listen to what kind of the before and after sounds like here. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. So it just sounds kind of dull, and I want that high-end sheen and that compression to sort of lift it above the mix so it can sit properly in the mix. So let's listen to it with Maserati. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. So I like that a lot better. It's got a lot more of that high-end lift that I like. After the VX1, I have Vocal Rider helping to level things out. And that's just sort of making sure that the performance is consistent throughout. There's multiple ways you can use this. You can have it react to your instrumental bus. You could group your instruments all together and have the vocal reacting to that and side chaining to the instrumental mix. You could have it on the bus, just the vocal bus and the group of vocals. Sometimes it'll work like that. It's a great way to save time with versus penciling in the automation like that. So with Vocal Rider, later on, a lot of times I will write the automation and then I can make little tweaks later on. But for the most part, it can kind of run on autopilot with these vocals. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. All the ways it could have been. It's not the same without you. You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days. So it's on each track, but all these tracks are also busing to a dedicated vocal bus that has Vocal Rider on there, and that's narrowing the dynamic range just a little bit. And I think, to me, it's really important to not have a plugin be doing drastic effects. I like it to do, a couple dB of gain reduction. That way, if you make a change at another stage in the mix, it doesn't radically throw things off. So that goes for everything from limiters to EQ. I like to work in layers, almost like you're varnishing something. It's like you have a layer you're coating it in a different layer of treatment each time, and you're doing several passes to get the effect that you want. So next up, the H delay, which is probably my favorite Waves plugin, mainly because it's really versatile. I can widen effects with it. I can widen instruments, move things out of center, especially when I want a kick drum to poke through in the center. I can just change the wet-dry balance to kind of move things back in the mix. You can even use it as a flanger. I haven't tried any plugin that has that same sort of feedback effect. So you can do crazy out-of-this-world effects that have really long delays, long feedbacks, or you can do really short delays and use that as a tool to just sort of open up the center of your mix and move things around. And I would never think of putting a bass line through a delay, but with this, yeah, I have sort of this mid-range bass line, and I'm going to use the delay to widen it, so it just sort of creates a wider image. It's not a super sub bass line. I have a sine wave that kind of fills it out, but let's put H delay on there right now. Also has a really nice tape effect, so you could automate the delay and get that cool sort of like tape effect. So that's really useful if you have high feedback. But typically I'll do short feedback, short delay, ping pong. And it's really important to me that in mono that it holds up. And I don't want to overdo the effect. So I'll dial in a balance of the dry and wet mix. So in dry, it sounds like this. In wet, it sounds wider, obviously. It's almost like a Haas effect. So I'll typically just figure out a balance of both, that I'll audition it in mono, press the mono button, and see, okay, this is sounding good, or doesn't fall apart in mono. That's really important. So it's adding kind of a little bit of almost like a room effect. I love the simplicity of this. There's not a ton of knobs to mess with, but there's a lot of power in here. I can switch on lo-fi for a grittier sound. It's kind of subtle in this case, but... Or I can add some modulation to make the pitch sort of change a little bit over time. Let's hear what these mid-range and bass layers sound like. So it's adding a little of that width to the top end of it. The bass is staying centered, because I'm not really doing anything crazy with width on that. And I think typically for club stuff, I like to keep the 150, 160 hertz and below pretty much mono, and that keeps the power in the center. Then you can play with all the other frequencies through the mids and the sides as well. So maybe we'll try that on some leads right now and just hear how that sounds. So with a higher sort of plucky lead, you could get a lot of really cool rhythmic complexity going on there, especially with dotted eighth notes, eighth note triplets. I love that it kind of reads out which delay you're on, and they're all in a logical order. It makes sense. So if it's an arpeggio or something like that, it can be something that really drives the song along, and those notes can really help push it forward. So let's hear it with the beat. So I'll jump around and be like, well, does the mood call for something like a longer delay or a shorter delay? I think with this one, maybe in the breakdown I'll do a longer delay where there's more space. But with something like the kick occupying all the bandwidth, I want to bring that delay probably shorter. If I want to just call attention to the lead itself and not have it be too complicated, I'll simplify it like that. So that is Waves H delay. We're going to move along to HEQ, the hybrid EQ, which is also one of my favorites. The most unique thing is the sort of the piano roll in here, where you can immediately lock into the frequencies of the notes that are used in a much more musical way. And I've been really surprised more companies haven't used more musical units for their plugins more often. I don't really think of frequencies. I think more in terms of notes and octaves, and especially with things like kick drums, like how is your kick decaying and what note does it resolve to? All that stuff's really, really important. And I love it because you can go in there, find your note, and not have to look up the frequencies in a chart. The spectrum analyzer in here is really good too. You can really clearly see what you're cutting, what's happening before and after, which is super important. You know, if I'm EQing a top kick and a bottom kick like here, I want to make sure the top kick has its own space. That's sort of the metronome of the track. And you can see I've done a very sharp high pass on that. And the highs are rolled off on the main kick, so they just sort of get along better. It feels again. Another trick I found with HEQ, sort of an unconventional way to do it. Basically here I'm going to show you how I'm tuning white noise to the key of the song. So we can just listen for a minute. White noise in dance music is used to occupy the frequency spectrum to kind of carry the song and fill out any gaps that are in there. Sometimes I'll use it as a straight hit on a snare, just to kind of fill it out and make it sound more full. A lot of guys will just sidechain it, have it throughout the track, use it as a rising effect or a falling effect. I can show you what just the white noise sounds like. So it's hard to hear any real tuning with that. When I put HEQ on, you can hear how the notes, the octave root notes are poking out in the mix in a good way. And this way I want it to be kind of tonal. It's almost like a drone. So maybe I'm just going to solo the drums so you can hear it a little better. So that's just noise, and here it is tuned. In your head, you feel like it's sweeter and it feels like it belongs there. It doesn't feel like a random group of frequencies. Basically, I pick out the octave points. So it's C#4, the fourth octave, C#5, C#6, C#7. So I'm doing harmonics in the key of the song all the way up. It's basically like going up the keyboard and I'm tuning it since it's C#. The white noise, it's boosting notes on all the octaves. So it's an octave effect, and you can carve it so it's a chord, but these frequencies are based just by dragging around on the keyboard here, and that's the beauty of it. You can pull these down and get right back there so you know what frequencies are the notes without having to look them up. You could do even thirds or fifths. You can make a chord out of it if you wanted to, because you're essentially carving out bits of the full spectrum. So you're selecting what part of the white noise you really want to hear, you really want to emphasize. So I could use that top filter, the low pass, I could automate that. If I want to just sweep that tuned white noise, I can just drag it. But I want to keep that there to sort of boost the high end and give it that energy. And it's cool because then with this, you can select all those points. You could drag it by octave. You could automate. If it's changing from one key to the next in the song, you could automate all that. And that's the beauty of plugins. So there is another favorite of mine. Every plugin is my favorite in this bundle. That's the whole idea. And so I picked one that's a much older plugin, and it's been sort of a secret weapon of the dance music world. A lot of guys will keep it secret and not even mention it, but I'm going to spoil the secret. It's called SoundShifter. For DJs, we need these things called risers, and it helps us mix in one song into the other if they're in a separate key. It also provides tension, and I'm going to show you how I used it on a snare to create an intro that pulls you into the next song. So typically I'll mix the intro and the outro, and DJ-friendly music are vehicles to get you into the song. So we're going to listen to this snare. So it's automated, and it's using SoundShifter to go up an octave or so. And there's different modes you can do. I decided it sounded best in sync, but you can see it can vary a lot. If I have it in, let's see, punch. I don't want to do it in punch because it doesn't sound consistent. Transient sounds pretty good. I'll put it on a little vocal chop. I'll chop the vowel of a vocal and have that rise sometimes. Crowd just knows to anticipate these rising pitch sounds, and that's just part of the genre. Okay, so one of the newer Waves plugins that I really like is called the NLS, and it's non-linear summer. It's basically a way to get the analog mixing, that summing sound of an analog mixer in the box. The software sounds so good now that it really does sound analog, and you can get a whole different sound for your mix. I have it on a lead sound. So right now, there's a little bit of drive on it. It's sort of this wide sound that it's reinforcing one of the lead synth elements. But the cool thing is, you have all these different flavors you can alternate through, and they sound pretty distinctly different. So to really show the differences, I'm gonna distort it and push it hard so you can hear the texture and the effect that you can get out of this. So I mainly use this for texture, but also as a safeguard against clipping, because with things like snare drums and things with really strong transients, you often will get clipping, and then when you put a limiter on it, it just sounds like it's missing something. It's missing that crack of the snare. And with this, I can push it, and there's no clipping going on. I can take advantage of that and not take up all the bandwidth. So it's a really cool effect. So it's especially useful for percussion, but right now I'm using it in a little more subtle way. So we're gonna try and push it and hear how it sounds different when I engage the mic button. So obviously a lot more texture, it's getting pushed, it's a more aggressive sound. So we can hear the difference between these three different models as I alternate between them. So with this, there's a pretty big difference with Mike's model in the middle. It sounds a little wider. There's something happening in the upper mid-range. It's really source dependent, and with this one, I really have to hear it in the context of the whole mix. So let's hear how it helps lift this sound in the mix. So you can hear it really helps to bring that sound up. It's not just because it's louder, it's because it's getting distorted. There's new harmonics being introduced. So I kind of want to even do it a little more strongly, do an even more aggressive sound. Sounds cool. Snare sound, typically you're getting very sharp transients, and you're battling kind of that headroom issue. So I'm going to use NLS to kind of push the snare even harder, so it has a little more weight and kind of cuts through the mix a little more. So I'm going to just sort of tweak some of the controls and experiment a bit. You can really hear the difference between the models there. Some of them have a more of a retro sound if you want a more vintage sound in your snare. I typically go for more modern, punchy, but more in your face. So the spike model is good for that. But you can really hear that difference when you alternate. It's just doing a little bit on each track, and altogether at the end is when you really see that impact. So it's more of a subtle effect, but I like to use it sometimes as a distortion tool and also as a way to prevent clipping. In every mix, I always have to have a reverb and a delay. These are just crucial bread and butter plugins for creating space and separation between the instruments. So TrueVerb, to me, it just sounds natural. It sounds real. It sounds like a real space. So it's very simple. There's not a lot of controls in here. I try to start with the presets and then adjust them as I need. You can really hear the effect with percussive instruments. And to me, a snare really needs to have a room sound. So let's listen to it without. Because it's a sample that I've cut up, there is sort of a choppiness to it at the end. It's being triggered, but there isn't this natural decay. So I want to add that decay. So it sounds a lot more natural. It sounds like more like a real drum and less like a sample. You can automate the decay time if you want. Sometimes you can get really cool effects with that. So in a track, sometimes maybe I'll, in the build-up to the drop, I might automate the length of the decay of the reverb. And that's one way to kind of create tension and create anticipation for that drop to happen. Automation is almost an instrument in itself in electronic music. So it's really important to be able to tweak all these controls to your liking and be able to do it quickly and get the effect that you really want. One really cool trick you can use is to sort of increase the presence of a bass line, especially like mid-range bass lines like I talked about earlier. So I have a very boring, small-sounding bass line, but I want to expand that a little bit. There's not a lot going on there, so I want to add some space. If you add too much space, too much reverb, with the decay time's too long, it's not really effective. It just sort of starts to overlap itself. It sounds kind of muddy. So using a fairly tight decay time will expand the image of that bass line. Even though it's a very small sound, using that reverb is a really cool way to expand it because you really need to make every sound stand out in the mix. So let's hear that with the kick and the bass together. So it's a pretty big difference. And the trick really is just making sure that your mix of wet and dry is balanced. And now I've dropped it a little more so you can go really subtle with it. You can make it completely transparent by having the shortest decay time possible, where you're actually not even really hearing any reverb. You're just hearing a little more fullness. But for me, it's a little too transparent, so I want to increase it a little bit more. And there I was checking it in mono just to make sure it's sitting in the mix. So you get the best of both worlds. You get that wide sound, but you also get that core mono sound. It's punchy, it's in the middle, and it's doing its job. Okay, so we're at the last plugin of the bundle, one of my favorites, L3LL. It's a really quick way to get a full sound, And especially when I'm doing a remix, I'm on a deadline, I need to have a really fat sounding master. I need to get it to the label really quickly. This is what I'll use. You can use it also for things like prepping remix stems, things like that, where you just want to add a little more punch or a little more polish in the mix. And I start with, there's actually a great preset in here, the Levine Mastering Limiter. And it brings a little more low end back in, a little more high end, some things that are kind of lost with compression. I like to use it very subtly where the attenuation is just kissing the meter there, just a little bit, a dB or two. With this mix, I'm using it a little more extreme, but let's hear it before and after. Obviously, it's going to be louder because I'm pushing the input a bit.
You'll always be the one I love. I'm missing the days thinking about you. All the ways it could have been. It's not the same without you. You'll always be.
It's a great way to really put that polish and get that loudness on your mix at the final stage. This bundle is sort of my desert island box of plugins, and I think there's a lot of amazing Waves plugins to choose from, and it can be overwhelming. And I wanted to narrow it down to just some key bread and butter plugins that allow a lot of versatility, allow me to write more quickly, allow me to track vocals and get the results that I want. For me, it's all about working as fast as possible with as minimal amount of clicks as possible. I don't like to spend a lot of time with left brain thinking. I want to go from the gut and really use my intuition to work as fast as possible. You only have a certain number of listens, especially with vocal tracks, where you can hit that point of no return and you've heard it 500 times and you're screwed. I want to keep the number of listens where I don't get sick of it and I can stay objective. So working really quickly is a big part of my work process. Okay, so those are some tips from my Waves EMP Toolbox. Hopefully you enjoyed that. You can check out more information about me online at morgan-page.com. You can follow me at twitter.com/morganpage and find out daily production tips at twitter.com/mpquicktips.